Greetings, comrades, sisters, and brothers. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 16. I am your host, Milton Ali Mahdi. Today, we discuss Malcolm X, and his attempts to build a solid bridge to Africa, connecting sisters and brothers in diaspora with the motherland for mutual benefit. So Malcolm was born Malcolm Little, of course, and that is a name he later on renounced as an enslaver's name. And since he did not know his original African name, that is why he adopted X and became Malcolm X. By the end of his life, he had other names. He had become, in addition to Malcolm X, Omowale, which is a Nigerian honorific given to him, meaning he who has returned. That came when he visited a couple of African countries in 1964. And he had already also converted and had become an Orthodox Muslim, a Sunni Muslim, and he made the pilgrimage to Makkah. So he had also become El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. Malcolm's life really is a true testament to a person's capability to transform himself or herself, in this case, himself, of course, multiple times. Malcolm was born in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, to Earl and Louise Little. Both of his parents were Garveyites, followers of Marcus Garvey. They opened a branch of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, which was what Marcus Garvey's organization was known. So, Nebraska, Omaha, by the time he's 6 years old, which is in 1931, his father is killed. His family believes that the father was killed by the KKK. So now he's with his mother and his siblings. The mother is struggling to raise his children, and she eventually has a breakdown, and she is institutionalized. So Malcolm ends up in Boston, where he's living with his siblings, and Malcolm becomes involved in criminal activities. And in 1946, barely 21, he is convicted for burglary and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. While in prison, that is when he makes the first dramatic transformation. He converts and becomes a follower of what was then known as the Black Muslim movement, led by Elijah Muhammad out of Chicago, later on known as Nation of Islam. An organization that, no matter how anyone feels about, has been remarkable in terms of one and other accomplishments, but one in particular is converting young men, mostly ex-criminals or criminals. In the case of Malcolm, he was still incarcerated, converting them onto a path of becoming productive citizens. And in Malcolm's case, that is the best testament to what the Black Muslim movement or Nation of Islam was able to accomplish So he becomes studious while still in prison. He starts by reading the entire dictionary, and he develops this insatiable appetite for reading and for information and for teaching himself. So he serves 6 years and then he's released in 1952. And he works with his brother, Wilfred, for a short while, selling furniture. And then later on, 52, he joins up with Elijah Muhammad in Chicago because Elijah Muhammad has realized and recognized Malcolm's exceptional talent as a master communicator. So very soon he is heading the very important mosque in Harlem, and he's barely 29. And his stature continues growing. He is the most articulate spokesperson that the Nation of Islam has. And the media also can't have enough of Malcolm, even when they disagree with him. He is a master debater and speaks in plain, common sense, but yet very intelligent language. So as Malcolm's stature keeps growing, eventually there is some resentment from others within the Nation of Islam. Because now when people thought the Nation of Islam, the name that pops up is Malcolm X, the chief spokesperson. So there were some that felt he was beginning to eclipse Elijah Muhammad himself. And a schism develops between headquarters in Chicago and the followers of Malcolm. And an incident happens in December 1963, which then gives the Nation of Islam out of Chicago the opportunity to suspend Malcolm. He had made a speech, and then he was asked by reporters what he felt about the assassination of President Kennedy. And Malcolm said, this is basically the chickens coming home to roost. And what is he referring to? Basically that in such a violent country, the United States, it should not be surprising that something like this would happen. So for that comment, he was suspended by the Nation of Islam. And eventually it became evident that the suspension would be permanent. So in early 1964, in March, Malcolm creates two organizations. One is the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, and that is basically emulating the Organization of African Unity, which had been founded the previous year in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, when the leaders of African countries that had won independence by that time decided to create this organization whose ultimate goal was to unite the African continent. So Malcolm creates an identical organization here in the United States to also mobilize diaspora Africans and to build a strong bridge and connection in order to be able to communicate effectively with Africa and African leaders because Malcolm saw that the salvation of African people, African descendants in the United States could benefit tremendously by having a solid connection with the African continent. And the second organization he sets up is Muslim Mosque Incorporated. And that organization obviously would allow him to continue appealing to Muslim followers who were loyal to him. But he also converts to Orthodox Islam, as I said earlier. He becomes a Sunni Muslim. But there's another special element to Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Malcolm recognizes that many African Americans are not Muslims. So he is willing to be flexible and allow membership to people that were not religious as well. Obviously, I expect that he probably thought or believed that at some point they would see the benefits to perhaps making a religious conversion as well. But I think coming from the very strict environment of the Nation of Islam, he wanted to have some flexibility in order to be able to expand his organizations. And that's why he came up with that relatively flexible requirement. But then Malcolm now sets on what he sees as the critical objective, which was to elevate the civil rights struggle in the United States. And he says, he likes saying, you don't take your case to the criminal. You take your criminal to court. And what did he mean by that? He meant by complaining about the racist attacks, abuse against African Americans in this country, in the South, taking the complaint to the United States government was like appealing to the criminal for a solution. So he came up with a different approach, which was to take the issue to the United Nations and raise it from a civil rights issue to a human rights issue. And that's where African leaders came into the equation. He wanted to convince African presidents or prime ministers to bring the issue before the United Nations, charge or accuse the United States of violating the human rights of African Americans, of United States citizens who just happen to be of African descent. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948, does proclaim that every human being is entitled to equal treatment and non-discrimination, regardless of their nationality, their race, their gender, their political persuasion. So Malcolm knew that was solid ground that he should work on. He had met many African diplomats at the United Nations. He met African leaders at the United Nations. He decided to focus on developing a more internationalist outlook. And by this time, he's now practicing some of the teachings of Marcus Garvey that he learned from his parents before he was separated from his parents by the murder of his father and by the incarceration or institutionalization, rather, of his mother after she had the breakdown. He met Kwame Nkrumah briefly in October 1960 when Nkrumah, Prime Minister of Ghana, the first African country south of the Sahara to win its independence from Britain, when Nkrumah came to address the United Nations. And after he addressed the United Nations, he was hosted in Harlem in a rally outside the famous Teresa Hotel on 125th Street. And he was hosted by the late Adam Clayton Powell, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. And one of the speakers at that rally was also Malcolm X. And he had met Fidel Castro the month before in September 1960 at the Hotel Teresa as well. And there's an iconic photograph that anybody can look up of the two of them having what seemed to be a entertaining conversation, very relaxed. They were shown in the photographs that are available online. But Malcolm's biggest mission was to actually attend the Organization of African Unity meeting in Cairo, Egypt in 1964. And he does attend. He wants to make his strong case to convince African leaders to take the issue of the suppression and oppression of African Americans before the United Nations. So he is successful in getting accreditation. And this is an issue that catches the attention of the United States establishment. The New York Times writes about it just before Malcolm leaves for the meeting and quotes a U.S. official who said that even if Malcolm were to succeed in convincing just one African government to take up the matter before the United Nations, that this would be a problem for the United States government. So Malcolm goes to Cairo and he prepares a memorandum that he is able to distribute and circulate to all the African leaders who are attending the conference. And basically he makes an appeal to them and says Africa and Africans cannot be free if African Americans in the United States are not free. And he also says that there's the issue of non-interference in internal affairs of other countries. But he challenges the African leaders. He says if racism and apartheid in South Africa was not an internal issue for the South African government, and that all African governments had rallied to oppose and reject and fight apartheid, then the oppression of African Americans should also not be regarded as an internal affairs of the United States government. While there, he also meets many leaders of the emerging liberation movements throughout Africa who had also been invited to attend the Organization of African Unity meeting in Cairo, which was hosted by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was one of the astounding Egyptian leaders when it comes to a Pan-African, Afrocentric outlook in Egypt, which is less so today than it was during the era of Nasser. So Malcolm is not successful in getting the African leaders to commit to bringing up the issue of oppression and suppression of African Americans before the United Nations. But he is successful in getting them to issue a resolution condemning the continuation of racism and discrimination in this country, calling to an end to racism and discrimination in this country, and also noting that the United States was moving on, enacting the Civil Rights Act. So that was a start. Obviously, Malcolm was not satisfied with that, but he believed that he would be successful if he met with the African leaders individually. And that is why he traveled to several African countries that same year in 1964. In fact, he spent 4.5 months on the continent. He met with Milton Obote, who was Prime Minister of Uganda, later became president. He met with Julius Nyerere, who was Prime Minister, Tanzania, later became president. He met with President Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. He met with President Sekou Toure of Guinea. He met with President Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. And he met with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. And these meetings occurred in those respective countries. I think in the case of Nyerere, Obote, and Kenyatta, he met them at the same time because there was a meeting of the East African, what was called the East African Community. I believe it was in Tanzania. So Malcolm was able to meet all of them at the same time. And one of the most critical meetings for Malcolm was a meeting with Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was a Pan-Africanist, was the foremost African leader insisting and demanding for African unity, a United States of Africa, as we examined in an earlier podcast. Nkrumah argued that our continent is too wealthy, they're not going to leave us alone. They will want to continue exploiting our resources even after independence. And the only way we will have the strength, the power to protect our sovereignty and our resources is by forming a United States of Africa. He lost the argument, but he was 100% correct. So Malcolm goes to Accra, Ghana, and by that time there's also a significant expatriate African American community that had migrated to Ghana because Nkrumah had created that environment that welcomed Africans from diaspora, Africans from around the continent. He was hosting many liberation movements because Nkrumah had said the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it was accompanied by the independence of the entire African continent. So there was a very Pan-African environment in Ghana at that time. W.E.B. Du Bois had just died the year before Malcolm visited. Nkrumah had hosted him. In fact, Du Bois is buried in Ghana. And there were many other African Americans who were prominent at the time or became much more prominent later on, including people like Maya Angelou, who also was one of those who hosted Malcolm when he arrived in Ghana, and Shirley Graham Du Bois, the widow of W.E.B. Du Bois, was a close advisor to Kwame Nkrumah, a personal friend, as her husband had also been. And she was in charge of the radio broadcast, television broadcast rather, in Ghana. So she was asked by some of the expatriate leaders to introduce Malcolm for a formal meeting with Kwame Nkrumah. And initially she said, there's no way I'm going to introduce a riffraff to my friend Kwame. And the reason she said that was because she was prejudiced toward the Nation of Islam based on what she had heard and what she had read about the Nation of Islam. But then she met Malcolm at a reception in Accra, and they got into a conversation, and they spoke for about an hour. And later on, she told other people that this man is absolutely brilliant. I must arrange the meeting with Kwame Nkrumah. They are so much alike, it would be a shame if they did not meet. So she does arrange the meeting, and Malcolm is able to meet with Kwame Nkrumah, whom he admired tremendously and had met briefly in 1960, of course, in Harlem. They have a long meeting, but once again, Malcolm is not able to convince Nkrumah to take up the matter of the suppression and oppression of African Americans to the United Nations. And later on, it was reported that Nkrumah essentially told Malcolm that while he sympathized and agreed with what Malcolm was suggesting, Ghana would not be able to do it because it would be regarded as interfering in the internal affairs of the United States. And that would give the United States the excuse to interfere in Ghana's internal affairs. Not that it mattered, because when Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966, the United States was involved through the CIA in deposing Nkrumah. But Malcolm does not give up. He comes back to the United States. He believes that once he gets the OAAU, his organization, on much more firm ground, he'd be able to meet these African leaders when they came to the United States, or he would continue his trips to Africa to continue lobbying to have the issue taken before the United Nations. This is now 1964, in October, when he returns to the United States. He makes another trip overseas. He goes to London, and in December, he addresses the Oxford Union debate, where he talks about the crisis in the Congo and how the media, working in collaboration with Western governments, had demonized Patrice Lumumba, allowed him to be murdered, and then had essentially propped up and glorified Lumumba's killer, Moïse Tshombe, who had been the leader of the secessionist part of the Congo, Katanga region, which was mineral rich and supported by the Belgians' mining interests, as well as the United States, France, and Britain. And that is a presentation that I highly recommend. Malcolm X Oxford Union presentation or debate, December 1964. He goes to France, to Paris, He wants to address Africans in diaspora in France, but he's prevented from entering France at the airport. He is referred to as an undesirable person. So obviously the United States government is now sending out instructions to its so-called allies to prevent Malcolm from entering some of these countries. And in every African country that Malcolm had visited, a U.S. diplomat was also there, trying to undermine his attempts to get these African leaders to agree to take the issue before the United Nations. So Malcolm goes back to London, and then from there returns to the United States. The Oxford Union debate was one of the last major events that Malcolm presented at, because on February 21st, just a few weeks later, Malcolm X is assassinated. And the next year, Kwame Nkrumah is overthrown in the CIA-sponsored coup. What might have happened had Malcolm lived? The tremendous potential. Malcolm was just beginning to really enter into his full stride. He had evolved from a petty criminal to a person who had become practically an international statesman. But he had also evolved philosophically. In the beginning, the media really loved him because they always knew they could get a good soundbite from him. And all they had to do was ask him, "What do you think about white folks?" That was no longer the Malcolm of 1965 by the time he's killed. The Malcolm of 1965 is now critiquing capital. And he's seeing the issue more in a political economic terms. So he's saying you cannot have capitalism without racism. And he is critiquing imperialism and neocolonialism in Africa. And he's analyzing the US conditions, the oppression and suppression of the African American population as sort of an